as I said, there's always a moment when this avoidance breaks down. In a city like Amsterdam, where now half of the population are migrant families, where 2/3 of school-going children, there's simply no way to continue to segregate to the extent that we did. Now we look back at that period, which we thought we were very tolerant, but that tolerance, in my view, was a culture of avoidance. Not asking any questions, because there was the myth of return, because people were no citizens of the future, these migrants, they were passers-by. And the migrants themselves didn't see themselves as people who would linger on. So no need to learn the language. You'd go home anyway. So when the children are born, and we're going to see exactly the same with the Polish immigrants now in Britain and in the Netherlands, they will not come back. At least half of them will stay. Why? Because the children will be born in Britain, the children will be born sooner or later in the Netherlands, and then they are taken hostage by the children. Because for the children there's no going back. So to the question, where are you from? I'm from here. No, but where are you really from? Yes, I'm from here. No, you understand what I'm saying? No, you don't understand what you're saying. I was born here. I may have a Pakistani surname, but I was born in Bradford. I may have a Turkish surname, but I was born in Amsterdam. So it doesn't mean anything to go back. There's no back. So that is when the conflict arises, when the myth of return breaks down, and the irrevocable change that has happened becomes apparent to everybody. So native populations start to realize that something irrevocably has changed because the migrants are not leaving. And these migrants themselves, children, they don't have the same distance as their parents towards the society because they think we are living here, our country, we have the rights, and they are far more vocal. If you look at the film, it was only apparent to us after finishing it, because then it suddenly struck me that in the first half of the film, which you could also see as a history of how immigration was portrayed before 1970, the first half of the film you don't see any migrants saying anything. They were silent. Nobody was interested in asking them anything. So the typical scene of recruitment where you see this Moroccan guy, you know, being asked, how will it be to live without your wife? Oh, no problem. Oui, monsieur. Oui, monsieur. Oui, monsieur. They were saying nothing. Not only being intimidated, but also not being asked anything. And that was the way we thought of being tolerant, not asking anything, which is, of course, a deep intolerance. Because if you don't ask awkward questions, you simply don't take the presence of somebody for consequential. So, the second generation, which you see in the second half, is very vocal. They speak so much as if they appear, you know, to make up for the silence of their parents. But also, native populations start to react far more outspokenly towards migrants, because the children are far more visible than the parents, because children tend to crowd the public sphere, tend to crowd the schools. So people start to touch each other's lives, which was not the case with the first generation. Very silent, very much hidden, working all the time, living in these overcrowded pensions, as we could have seen. So that is the moment when conflict arises. I think conflict should be understood as part of migration history, and it should be understood as rational. We tend to think about conflict in part of migration history, you know, as the underbelly, as irrational reactions. I think conflict as part of migration history is, for me, very understandable. There are three main sources of conflict. First source is social economic. Migration leads to redistribution of income in society. Very simple. It causes pressure in the lower rungs of the labor market, because why are migrants interesting for entrepreneurs? Because they earn less and are pliable, non-organized. So why is there no socialism in the United States? Because it's a real immigrant society. because there was always an influx of unorganized, lowly paid labor force. So it was very difficult. The trade unions in the United States were already at the end of the 19th century very much on the side of immigration restriction. We're always thinking, you know, it undermines the coherence of the native labor force. Why were, on the other side, entrepreneurs always pro-immigration? Because it's the best deal. And especially in conditions of a welfare state, where there is a lot of social economic benefits attached to citizenship, the access of migrants to the welfare state is hotly contested. So there is a real clash of interests, which is understandable. It's no deep secret to understand the social economic dimension of the conflict surrounding migration. Second source of conflict throughout history is cultural and religious. So if we compare the arrival of Muslim migrants in our time with the arrival of Catholic immigrants from Poland, from Italy, from Ireland, in Protestant America, I would say the conflict in Protestant America has been far more violent, far more aggressive than what we witness today surrounding Muslim communities in our part of Europe. Catholic immigrants were not at all welcome in America, and that is really the understatement of the year. They were not at all welcome. Why? Because they were deemed to be people with a loyalty towards Rome, who could never become serious citizens of the United States. It was seen as a conspiracy of the Vatican, and it was absolutely clear to most Protestant Americans that a Catholic American was simply not possible. Because as a Catholic, your loyalty would not be America. So there was a deep denial of the possibility that Catholics could become American citizens. And it took until 1960 to vote for the first time for a Catholic as a president, John F. Kennedy. And he had to explain in his electoral campaign, day in, day out, that his first loyalty was America, not Rome. It was not at all self-evident under 20 years after the first Catholic Irish immigrants in 1840 arrived in cities like New York and Boston, that somebody with a Catholic background could become president of the United States. So what happened? And that is for me entails the essence of why we shouldn't see conflict as the failure of integration, but as integration at work. In the conflict, America reimagined itself as a country, and that took years and years, decades, reimagined itself as a country not exclusively Protestant, but these Catholic minorities reimagined themselves because they came from countries which were 100% Catholic. They reimagined themselves as part of a culture of religious freedom, of religious pluralism. So that was a painful adaptation on both sides, which went along with a lot of conflict. So the whole idea of America as a nation of immigrants, that is an harmonious story, is definitely not true. It was a story full of conflict and often quite harsh conflict. With, next to social economic reasons, there was a lot of conflict surrounding cultural and religious questions. And I think the same, to some extent, is what we're seeing today. That is to say, conflict between societies where the Islam doesn't have any tradition, and the arrival of Muslim migrants from communities where Islam has the quasi-monopoly over social and religious life. And of course that leads to conflict. It would be very strange if it wouldn't lead to conflict on both sides. The question is, of course, how are we going to evolve from this conflict? But I see in the conflict non-violent conflict. There will also be forms of violent conflict. In a non-violent conflict, I see the search of a way, how are we going to live together? What does it mean to be a French Muslim from the point of view of these Muslims? And what does it mean from the point of view of being French? How does the French majority opens up to the possibility of people seeing themselves, identifying themselves as French Muslims? Third source of conflict, to be very brief, is international conflict spilling over into domestic realities. So look at America again. The German-American population, the largest migrant community in America around 1900. When the First World War erupted, as long as America was neutral, there was no problem. The moment America was caught into the horrors of the First World War, that was the moment that suspicion against the German-Americans started, that there was huge pressure on the German-American community, 6 million people in total, to assimilate to the extent that German surnames were changed after the First World War. The German publications in German language stopped. There were 800 weeklies and dailies in America before the First World War, none after the First World War, etc. So a story of brutal pressure, but also a story of ambiguous loyalties, because many German Americans really had a great difficulty in identifying with America when it came into a war with Germany. I don't have to tell the story, which is wider known, of the internment of the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, but to tell only these two examples gives you an idea that the story of migration in America was always full of contradictions. Now shift to our time. We see it again, how international conflict in the Middle East spills over into our own streets. I live 300 meters from a synagogue. Since half a year, there's now heavy police protection. Why? Because there is a growing anti-Semitism in the Muslim communities of Amsterdam. We can talk about it in a very polite way, we can talk about it in a politically incorrect way. Whatever way you talk about it, that's a reality. And it's a reality not born out of domestic strife, because there's no real antagonism between Jewish community in Amsterdam and the Moroccan community. Not really. It's the Intifada landing in our streets. It's the identification of a lot of young Moroccan kids with the idea, the plight of the Palestinians. Whatever reason there's now 3,000 young people, young Muslims fighting in Syria and Iraq, and that's a huge, huge, serious problem. Why? Because first of all, it's not nihilism that brings them there, but idealism. I'm absolutely convinced that they are idealists, so that their motivation shouldn't be far away from us, but very understandable. They want to live their religion, which they think is soiled by living in a decadent country like the Netherlands or France. They want to live a pure Islam. So it's idealism that leads them there in the first place, an identification with what they see as the victims of oppression. But they will get traumatized because it's a war. They will learn how to kill, will be killed themselves partly, will have seen scenes of horror, and then return partly. And we already see the consequences. There is a huge threat. It was not only the attack in Ottawa and the killings in the Brussels Museum, Jewish Museum in Brussels, but most people I speak in the Netherlands of security services, people who are monitoring it, say that similar attacks will occur in many other European countries. Not a question if, but more a question of when. So that's of course a huge consequence it has and spills over into domestic realities. Now, to conclude, because of course you can describe avoidance, segregation, you can describe the sources of conflict, make them understandable, not as an irrational reaction, but as an understandable conflict that arises from both sides. Now the question is, of course, accommodation. I think there's one way of looking at accommodation which I think is mistaken, and that is multiculturalism. I think multiculturalism is a very conservative way of looking at migrant communities. Why is it conservative? Because it is basically the idea that migrants from one generation to the other conserve their culture. So there is something like a Turkish community, not only the first generation, which for understandable reasons still sticks very much to their idea of Turkish culture, but also their children, the children of their children, will be, in a recognizable way, will remain Turkish. It's a deeply conservative idea, which first of all denies the experience of loss. Because why are people losing something if nothing changes? Of course something changes. So multiculturalism is, in my view, completely mistaken, because in an empirical sense, there is of course change. Just to give you a few examples. The children of migrants speak not very fluent. Quite a few of them don't speak at all the language of their parents. So there is a loss of language from one generation to the other. Third generation, typically only 10 or 20% still speaks the language of their grandparents. So that's a sense of loss. If you look at remittances, the money being wired back to the country of origin. First generation, yes, a lot of money is being transferred back to family at home. Second generation, very little. So the orientation of the second generation is not towards Turkey or Morocco, Pakistan or India or the Caribbean. No, it's towards a country in which they were born. That is why the Turkish government and the Moroccan government, because remittances are a real source of income, why they lean so heavily on this second generation. They want to keep them close. But the reality is, of course, that this second generation, let alone the children of the children, third generation, is escaping them. Just ask somebody of the second generation, where are you going for a holiday? More and more people will tell you, I'm definitely not going for a month from one family visit to the other in Morocco. I want to go to Ibiza to party, like a lot of young people in the Netherlands do. If you look at family size, if I talk to a woman from a Muslim community, second generation, she tells me, I'm very much a Muslim still. But she has typically 2 children, like, let's say, the average in the Netherlands. Not 5 or 6 children like her mother. So there's a huge change in the reality of family relations. So I could go on and on and on. But there is the story of migration from the point of view of migrants is a story of continuous change. And multiculturalism doesn't understand that change. Secondly, there is a deep normative problem with multiculturalism. If I come in a school in Antwerp, just to give you that example, I come across teachers, 80% of the school are Muslim children. Teachers tell me, it has become very difficult in literature class to speak about Oscar Wilde, because he's homosexual, perverse. Of course, when you start to eliminate all the perverse writers from your literary history, you end up with a very, very short history indeed, but okay. They tell me it's become very difficult in history class to talk about the Holocaust because the children think it's a lie, and if it's not a lie, perhaps it was a good idea. Thirdly, it's become very difficult in biology class to talk about evolution, because there's no such thing as evolution. It becomes very difficult to send children to mixed swimming classes, etc., etc. Now, multiculturalism will tell you, live and let live. How are you going to practice that in a school? Means abandoning your curriculum. But how are you going to do that in mixed classes, where half of the class say, no, I want to know about evolution, the other half doesn't want to hear anything about it. And how are you going to do the examination? Are you going to skip then the Holocaust from your examinations or whatever? No, of course not. So, you're going to create conditions in the school where you defend the curriculum. And then of course you have to know why are you defending the curriculum. And that is of course because there are limits to multiculturalism, to the whole idea of live and let live. Every opinion, every tradition has the same saying. No, it's simply not true. It's not what we practice, and we should be honest about what we are. Multiculturalism would mean you don't have any common day of rest anymore. Because why is Sunday? It's a Christian invention, isn't it? Why not, why not all rest together on a Saturday, on a Friday? Why speak about the year 2014? It's our idea of how we count the years, but Jews count in a very different way, and people in China in different. If you come to think of it, you can almost take away everything you have in common, because if you want to be strictly multicultural, you know where you begin, but you end up somewhere in a nebulous idea. So I think the reality is something different, which I think asks far more of us all, on both sides. And that is where I will end with 4 simple conclusions. Because for me, the essence and the great, great enrichment of migration is that it forces a society to contemplate about its fundamental values, its fundamental norms, and basically about the idea of citizenship. That is not at all abstract, because if you ask migrants to see themselves as citizens, the question comes back, of course, what does it mean to be a citizen? Integrate into what, actually? And there was a great, great embarrassment in almost all European societies in the last 20 years, but also in America, throughout its history, in answering that question. Integration into what, actually? So, to give you an example, I can remember, fierce debates where people were saying to migrants, you should know something about our constitution. You should read that constitution. And of course, there is always, sooner or later, quite often sooner than later, a smart guy, Turkish or Moroccan, whatever, stands up and says, did you read this constitution yourself? Which is a good question, because why should you ask something to people who came if you're not willing to do it yourself? So of course nobody in the Netherlands has read the Dutch constitution. Now you can draw 2 conclusions. You can say it's a nonsensical thing, why should people read the constitution? Or you can say we learned something in the whole discussion about what it means to integrate, to be a citizen. We discovered some things perhaps that we as a society were neglecting. So my 4 conclusions are simply this. First of all, we discovered the meaning of language. Because you could say it's a very tolerant thing to say to migrants, you shouldn't learn Dutch or French or German. But it's of course a way to exclude people. To say your presence will never be meaningful because you're a guest in our house, and guests normally don't decide about the color of the curtains and where the furniture, what furniture. So, as a guest, you don't have to speak the language. But migrants are, of course, in the long run, not guests, but citizens, and will decide about the house. But then they have to speak the language. And the strange thing that happened was, through all these discussions about language, what emerged was the knowledge that quite a few native Dutch people were functionally illiterate. So out of understanding the meaning of language in terms of citizenship, grew the understanding that there were hundreds of thousands of people in the Netherlands who really had great difficulty in reading and writing. Second example, knowledge. Beyond capabilities such as speaking the language. What sort of knowledge do you really need to be a functioning citizen, an effective citizen? You can disagree about it at length. But what we discovered in talking about the sort of knowledge through civic courses in our education is that it changed our education from a perspective on education as preparation for a profession to also thinking about education as a preparation for citizenship. And then the question, of course, what do you need to know about history, about legal affairs, whatever. You can discuss. But I know that our education has changed for everybody, because why should you ask something different from a child with a migrant background than from everybody's child? Everybody as a child is a newcomer, to a certain extent. So that is the second example, that our education changed. Third example is participation. I cannot think of citizenship without participation. So the whole thing led to a renewal of our idea of the welfare state. Because 50% of the first generation doesn't work in countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and France. which is unique in the history of migration. The welfare state, as it functions, had a great effect to the negative when it comes to migration. So we are rethinking, and not only for migrants, but for everybody. What is the meaning of the welfare state, and how can the welfare state be transformed into a system of social protection that helps social mobility? Because we have succeeded in making part of our society that is most risk-prone, most entrepreneurial, into the most dependent part of our society, dependent upon social security. Last example, most complicated of all, that is of course the normative meaning of citizenship. When I'm invited in a mosque, I always say more or less the following. I say, you are right in emphasizing that you have a right to practice your religion, to build mosques. There is nothing in our constitution that is about the separation of state and church, about religious freedom, about freedom of expression, that forbids you to build mosques. So we have now 500 mosques in the Netherlands, quite sizable ones, not very beautiful, but that's another discussion. But I add, I say, you cannot claim a right without accepting the responsibility to defend the same right for people with other religions or no religion. So if you think you can live here, being a Muslim, with using the religious space that you have created for yourself as a way to vilify, demonize others, then in the end you will be demonized yourself. You cannot expect others to open up to your presence if you don't open up to the presence of others yourself. It's a very simple idea of fairness. You get something and you give something. You cannot claim rights without guaranteeing those rights for others with whom you deeply disagree. And that appears to be very, very difficult for majorities in France, Germany, Britain, wherever, who think Islam doesn't have a place in our democracy. For people, Orthodox people in the Muslim communities who say democracy has no place in our Islam. Both are understandable reactions, but in the end, if there are no majorities on both sides which live with the simple idea of reciprocity, of rights and responsibilities, then it all goes wrong. And I think when I'm sitting across, a room and there are